The notice was a single sheet of paper, cheap stock, flapping against the front door of the rental house in Barlow, Oregon. It was held by a single piece of packing tape that was already losing its fight with the damp October air. Frank Cole, 54 years old, and a man who had learned to read the weather in a situation long before he read the words, knew it was bad news. The paper said they had until morning. Not the end of the month, not a week. Morning. The whole block had been sold to a developer, Harmon Properties, and their lease was now just an obstacle to a bulldozer. He stood on the cracked porch, the paper limp in his hand, and felt a familiar, cold hollowing in his gut. It was the same feeling he'd had in the moments after a blast, when the world was silent and ringing and you didn't yet know who was gone. His daughter, Sarah, 17, and with eyes that saw too much, came to stand beside him. She didn't have to ask. She just looked from the paper to her father's face, and her shoulders slumped. "How?" she asked, the words small and fragile. "Money, kiddo. Always is." He folded the paper, the crease sharp and definite, a habit from folding maps in places where unfolds had to be silent. The next few hours were a blur of controlled chaos. Frank moved with the grim efficiency of a man practiced in evacuations. He was a machine built for packing life into boxes under duress. 20 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him that you carry what you need, you abandon what you don't, and you never, ever look back at the fire. But this wasn't a firefight. This was his daughter's bedroom, her posters of bands he'd never heard of, the bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks, the small wooden bird she'd carved in shop class. Each item he packed felt like a failure. Grit, his Belgian Malinois, moved through the house with them, a silent, amber-eyed shadow. The dog, now 9 years old and graying at the muzzle, had been his partner through 2 deployments. Grit had dragged him from the twisted metal of a Humvee outside Fallujah, his own flank torn open by shrapnel, and had stayed by his head until the medevac birds screamed overhead. Now, the dog nudged his hand with his nose, sensing the tremor Frank tried to hide. They were out by midnight, the last of their life loaded into his aging Ford F-150. The landlord, a man named Peters who couldn't meet his eye, was there with 2 men from the developer's office. They watched, impassive as Frank handed over the keys. "Sorry, Frank," Peters mumbled. "They made an offer I couldn't turn down." Frank just nodded. He understood transactions. He understood leverage. He put his hand on Sarah's shoulder and guided her to the truck. They drove away from the only stable home she'd known for 3 years, the streetlights illuminating the house for a moment, before it slipped into the darkness behind them. For 6 days, they lived in a purgatory of cheap motels and truck-stop diners. The money from his last contracting job was dwindling fast. Every time he looked at Sarah, hunched over a textbook in the dim light of a motel lamp, the shame was a physical weight. He had faced down men with guns, had survived things that killed better men, but he couldn't keep a roof over his own daughter's head. On the 7th day, he found himself driving back through Barlow, a route he'd promised himself he would avoid. He told himself he was just checking the mail at the post office, but he knew he was a moth drawn to a flame. He wanted to see it one last time before it was gone. He parked down the street. The house was still standing, but now it was surrounded by a chain-link fence. A large Harmon Properties sign was staked into the dying lawn. It felt like an insult. He got out of the truck, telling Sarah he'd be right back. Grit whined in the passenger seat, his ears twitching. Frank walked the perimeter, his hands in his pockets. He felt the dog's anxiety like a current running up the leash. As they passed the long, unbroken side wall of the house, the one that faced the empty lot next door, Grit suddenly stopped. The dog went rigid, his hackles rising. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound Frank hadn't heard since their last tour. Grit pulled, the leash straining, his nose pressed against the chain link, his focus locked on a specific section of the brick facade. "Easy, boy," Frank said, giving the leash a gentle tug. Grit didn't budge. He planted his feet, his entire body a taut line of concentration, his gaze fixed on the wall. He whined, a high, insistent sound of discovery. Frank looked closer, his curiosity piqued by the dog's certainty. It was just a wall, faded red brick, a little moss growing in the mortar lines. He'd seen it 1,000 times. But now, guided by the dog's unwavering stare, he saw it differently. He started counting the windows on the front of the house, then pacing out the dimensions he knew by heart. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway. He knew every square foot of that place. He knew the length of the living room wall on the inside. He turned and looked at the exterior again. It was wrong. From the corner of the house to the edge of the back porch, the exterior wall was a good 6, maybe 7 feet longer than the interior wall it was supposed to contain. There was a section of brickwork, about 8 feet wide, where the color was subtly different, the mortar a shade paler, as if it had been done at a different time. There was no door, no window. Just a seamless stretch of brick that concealed a space that, from the inside, did not exist. For 3 years, he had slept on the other side of that wall, never knowing. Grit knew. The dog knew something was in there, and he would not let it go. Frank knelt, his hand on Grit's neck, the dog's muscles still coiled tight. The wind carried the smell of rain and cut lumber from the Harmon construction site 2 blocks over. Demolition was coming, and it was coming soon. He looked at the wall, then back at the truck where Sarah was watching, her face a pale oval in the window. The house was no longer his, but the secret inside it felt like a direct challenge. His training, the part of him that had been dormant and rusting, began to stir. You don't ignore a detail that doesn't fit. You don't walk away from a closed door that shouldn't be there. He clicked the leash. "All right, boy," he whispered, his voice low and calm. "Let's go see what you found." The cheap price of discovery wouldn't be in dollars. It would be paid in risk, under the cover of darkness, with the sound of his own heart beating a steady, familiar drum against his ribs. The price was breaking back into the life that had been taken from him. That night, the air grew cold enough to show his breath. He left Sarah at the motel with strict instructions. Lock the door, don't answer for anyone, and if he wasn't back by 400, she was to take the emergency cash, get on a bus to her aunt's in Seattle, and not look back. She argued, of course. She had his stubbornness. But when she saw the look in his eyes, the flat, professional calm that had settled over him, she just nodded and hugged him tight. "Be careful, Dad," she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "Always." Grit sat by the motel room door, watching him go, but he didn't whine. The dog understood the mission. Frank drove the F-150 to a side street 2 blocks from the house and parked it in the deep shadows of an overgrown oak tree. He walked the rest of the way, keeping to the alleys. He wore dark clothes, soft-soled boots, and carried a small canvas tool bag. Inside was a set of bolt cutters, a pry bar, a hammer, and a heavy wool blanket. The chain-link fence was new and taut. The padlock on the gate was a heavy-duty master lock. He could have picked it, but cutting the chain itself was faster and quieter. He wrapped the bolt cutter's jaws in a piece of leather from his bag, to muffle the snap of the metal. With a single, controlled squeeze of the handles, the link parted with a dull thud. He slipped through the gap he'd created and moved across the lawn, his steps silent on the damp grass. The house was a dark shape against a starless, overcast sky. No security patrols, not yet. Harmon was arrogant. He thought a fence and a sign were enough. Frank went directly to the section of wall Grit had identified. Up close, the difference in the brickwork was undeniable. The mortar lines were cleaner, the bricks themselves a slightly brighter shade of red, as if they'd been shielded from the worst of the weather for years before being exposed. He ran his hand over the surface. It was solid. He wasn't going through the brick. That was too loud, too slow. He was betting that whoever sealed this had done it from the outside, and that the original structure was still underneath. He moved to the front door. The developer's crew had screwed a thick sheet of plywood over it. He used the pry bar, leveraging it carefully in the corners, working the screws out of the soft wood of the door frame with minimal noise. A minute later, the plywood groaned and came free. The original door was still there, locked. He didn't bother with the lock. He went to a side window, one he knew had a faulty latch. A thin piece of metal from his wallet, a little pressure, and the lock slid open. He raised the sash, slipped inside, and was immediately enveloped in the familiar smell of his own life. Sawdust, old books, and the faint scent of the lemon cleaner Sarah always used. It was a ghost's homecoming. He didn't use a flashlight. He knew the layout by touch. He moved into the living room and stood before the interior wall, the one that backed onto the hidden space. He ran his hands over the drywall, searching for a seam, a hollow spot, anything. Nothing. It was a perfect, smooth wall. They had done a good job. He went back outside, retrieved his tools, and returned to the living room. There was only one way to do this. He placed the heavy wool blanket on the floor against the baseboard to catch the debris and muffle the sound. Using the sharp end of the pry bar, he punched a small, exploratory hole through the drywall. It went through easily. He used a small utility knife to cut a larger square, peeling the paper and gypsum away. Behind it was not insulation and studs as there should have been. It was a solid sheet of steel, rusted in places, with a thick, ugly weld bead running down its entire length, fusing it to a heavy steel frame that had been bolted into the house's foundation and ceiling joists. This wasn't just sealed. This was a vault. And on the other side of that steel plate, something waited in 30 years of silence. The discovery of the steel plate shifted everything. This wasn't a forgotten pantry or a walled-off room from a clumsy renovation. This was deliberate. This was containment. Frank stood back, the beam of his small penlight tracing the jagged, thick line of the weld. It was agricultural-grade welding, strong but crude, done by someone who cared more about permanence than aesthetics. Whoever put this plate here wanted to ensure that whatever was behind it stayed behind it, and that no one would stumble upon it by accident. He ran his fingers over the bolts holding the frame in place. They were half-inch thick, sunk deep into the old-growth timber of the house's frame. Trying to get through them would take hours and make a hell of a noise. The weld was the weak point. It was ugly, which meant it was likely uneven, with pockets of slag and poor penetration. He went back to the truck. Tucked away in a locked box under the rear seat was the rest of his toolkit, the one he didn't keep for household repairs. From it, he pulled a compact angle grinder and a fresh cutting wheel. It was loud, but it was the only way. Back inside, he hung the heavy wool blanket over the area he intended to cut, creating a small tent to hopefully baffle some of the noise and contain the sparks. He put on a pair of safety glasses and took a deep breath. The high-pitched scream of the grinder cut through the silence of the house, a sound of violent entry. It felt wrong, desecrating a place that had been his home, but the dog's certainty and the sight of that steel wall had ignited a cold fire in him. He wasn't just a trespasser anymore. He was an investigator. He was opening a tomb. Sparks showered against the wool blanket, brilliant orange tears in the darkness. The smell of ozone and hot metal filled the small space. He worked methodically, cutting along the line of the old weld, the grinder bucking in his hands. It was slow, hard work. After 20 minutes, his arms ached and the air was thick with abrasive dust, but a 3-foot section of the weld was cut through. He used the pry bar, wedging it into the new seam he'd created. He put his weight into it, and with a deep, groaning screech of tortured metal, the plate bent outward. He pushed it just far enough to squeeze through the gap. The air that flowed out of the hidden room was cold and impossibly stale. The smell of dust, decaying paper, and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood or rust. He shone his light into the darkness. It was a small, windowless office, no more than 6 feet deep. A simple wooden desk stood against the far wall, a rotary-style office chair before it. A 2-drawer metal filing cabinet was tucked in the corner, and on the desk, placed squarely in the center, was a dusty leather-bound journal and a heavy olive-drab steel box, the kind used for military-grade munitions or sensitive equipment. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on something. He looked down. The floor was littered with spent cigarette butts and a few empty ration cans. Someone had lived in this room, or at least spent a lot of time here. He picked up the journal. The leather was dry and cracked. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise. The ink faded from black to a brownish gray. My name is Arthur Vance. The date is October 17th, 1993. If you are reading this, it means I failed, and it means Harmon got what he wanted. Frank's blood went cold. Harmon. The same name on the developer's sign. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a direct line, a 30-year-old echo. He flipped through the pages. Vance, he learned, was an investigative journalist for a small, defunct Portland paper. He had been looking into a series of suspicious land deals in Barlow, orchestrated by a then-young and ambitious developer named Alistair Harmon, the father of the man now trying to bulldoze this house. Vance had uncovered a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and what he suspected was murder, all aimed at acquiring land and, more importantly, the water rights that came with it. He had collected affidavits from farmers who had been threatened, found forged signatures on deeds filed with the county, and traced the money back to a shell corporation owned by Harmon Sr. He had compiled all his evidence, the original documents, the tape-recorded interviews, the photographs, and stored them in this room, which had been his secret office. The last entry was dated November 4th, 1993. He knows. I don't know how, but he knows about this room. A car has been parked across the street for 2 days. This morning, I found the back door welded shut from the outside. He's trying to bury me in here. I'm going to try to cut my way out through the floor into the crawl space. I've sealed the wall from this side with a piece of sheet metal and construction adhesive. It's not much, but it might hide the room long enough for someone to find this. Don't let him get this box. Frank looked at the steel box on the desk. It was locked with a simple padlock. He broke it easily with the pry bar. Inside, nestled in yellowing foam, were dozens of microfiche slides, several cassette tapes, and a thick stack of bearer bonds worth, at a quick glance, a substantial amount of money. This was Vance's leverage, his insurance policy, and now it was Frank's. As he stood there, the journal in one hand and a cassette tape in the other, he heard it. The crunch of gravel outside, the low rumble of a heavy truck engine idling. Headlights swept across the front of the house, their beams cutting through the dirty windows and slicing into the darkness of the living room behind him. They were here. Frank killed his light instantly, plunging the small room into absolute blackness. He didn't move, didn't breathe. His heart, which had been hammering from the exertion and the discovery, settled into a slow, steady combat rhythm. He was no longer Frank Cole, evicted father. He was Senior Chief Cole, operating behind enemy lines. He edged back to the gap he'd cut in the steel plate and peered through. 2 sets of headlights illuminated the front yard. A heavy-duty pickup truck, the kind contractors use, sat idling just outside the fence. 2 men got out. They weren't wearing the fluorescent vests of a demolition crew. They were dressed in dark work jackets and jeans, and they moved with a purpose that was not about construction. One was thick-set and walked with a slight limp. The other was tall and thin, restlessly scanning the property. They walked the fence line, their powerful flashlights cutting cones of white light through the darkness. Frank tracked their movements, his mind a cold calculator of angles and threats. They stopped at the gate, right where he had cut the chain. The tall one knelt, his light focused on the severed link. He said something to the other man, his voice a low murmur lost to the wind and the glass. The man with the limp grunted in reply. They weren't just security. They were looking for something, or someone. They knew, or at least suspected, that the site had been breached. Harmon was more careful than Frank had given him credit for. He had people checking his new acquisition. Frank backed away from the wall, melting into the deeper shadows of the sealed room. He had to make a decision. Stay and hide, or exfil with the evidence. Staying was a trap. The room had one exit, and they were between him and it. He had to move. He worked quickly and silently, his motions economical. He swept the microfiche, the tapes, and the bearer bonds from the steel box into his own canvas tool bag. The box itself was too cumbersome. He took the journal, tucking it securely inside his jacket. He left the room as he had found it, a dusty tomb, save for the broken lock on the box. He couldn't hide the hole he'd cut in the wall, but he could make it less obvious from a distance. He squeezed back through the gap, and with a grunt of effort, pushed the bent section of the steel plate as flush against the frame as he could. It wasn't perfect, but in the dark, it might pass a cursory inspection. He gathered his tools, moving back through the house toward the rear window he'd used for entry. As he reached the kitchen, he heard their voices again, closer this time. They were inside the fence. One of them was testing the plywood over the front door. A heavy thud echoed through the house. Frank froze, every muscle tensed. He was cut off. The back of the house was his only way out, but it opened onto a clear, moonlit patch of yard before the fence. He'd be exposed. He changed his plan. He slipped down the hallway to the small bathroom at the back of the house. The window was small, high on the wall, but it was his only option. He climbed onto the toilet, unlatched the window, and pushed it open. It looked out onto the narrow space between the house and the overgrown hedge marking the property line. It was a tight squeeze, but it offered cover. He pushed his bag of tools and evidence through the window first, letting it drop silently onto the soft earth below. Then he pulled himself up and through, landing with a soft thud. He grabbed the bag and pressed himself flat against the brick foundation, concealed by the deep shadows of the hedge. The two men were at the front of the house now, their flashlight beams playing over the door. He could hear the scrape of a pry bar against the plywood. They were coming in. He didn't wait. Keeping low, he moved along the hedge line toward the back of the property, a ghost in his own former home, the weight of a dead man's 30-year-old fight heavy in his hands. He made it back to the motel just before dawn, slipping into the room like a wraith. Sarah was asleep in a chair by the door, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, the television murmuring on low. Grit lifted his head from his paws, gave a single, silent thump of his tail on the carpet, and then settled back down. Frank gently woke Sarah, and in the cheap, dim light of the motel room, he laid out the contents of the bag on the bed. The journal, the tapes, the slides. His name was Arthur Vance, he said, his voice raspy. He was a reporter. Harmon's father trapped him in a hidden room in our house 30 years ago. I think he killed him. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the evidence. She picked up one of the cassette tapes, turning it over in her hands. "What are we going to do?" she asked. She didn't say, "What are you going to do?" She said, "We." A fierce surge of pride cut through Frank's exhaustion. "First, we see what's on these," he said, pointing to the microfiche slides. "Then we find someone who can't be bought." Their first stop was the Barlow County Library. It was a small, quiet building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Martha, looked skeptically at the microfiche slides. "We haven't had a reader for those in years," she said. "But the county records office in the courthouse might. Ask for Eleanor Vance." Frank's head snapped up. "Vance?" "Yes, she's the county clerk. Been there forever. Arthur was her cousin." It was the first real break, a thread of connection across 3 decades. They found Eleanor Vance in a cramped, dusty office in the basement of the courthouse, surrounded by towering shelves of bound ledgers. She was in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When Frank mentioned her cousin's name, her professional demeanor cracked just a little. A shadow of an old, deep pain crossed her face. "Arthur," she said softly. "He just vanished. The police said he ran off. I never believed it." Frank placed the journal on her desk. "He didn't run off, ma'am. He was silenced." Eleanor opened the journal, her fingers tracing her cousin's familiar handwriting. Her breath hitched. For a long moment, she just read, silent and still. Finally, she looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a new, hard light of anger. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew Harmon was dirty." She led them to an old microfiche reader in a back room. One by one, they projected the slides onto the small screen. The evidence was damning. Forged deeds, notarized with a stamp that had been reported stolen. Sworn affidavits from farmers describing threats and midnight visits from Harmon Sr.'s men. A detailed ledger tracking payments to a shell company that eventually fed back to Harmon himself. It was a meticulous record of a systematic and ruthless conspiracy to steal the valley's land and water. Arthur Vance had built an airtight case. As they were packing up the slides, Eleanor put a hand on Frank's arm. "You need to be careful," she said, her voice low. "Alistair Harmon is his father's son, but with more polish and deeper pockets. He owns the sheriff. He has a judge on his payroll. You can't fight him here, in his town." Just then, Frank glanced out the grimy basement window that looked out onto the courthouse parking lot. A black Lincoln Navigator, The same model he'd seen used by high-end security contractors was parked across the street. A man in a suit sat in the driver's seat, staring directly at the courthouse entrance. He hadn't been there when they arrived. They had been followed. The net was tightening. Eleanor saw the look on his face and followed his gaze. "They know," she said, her voice grim. "They must have put a tracker on your truck. You can't go back to your motel." Frank's mind was already working, processing the new threat. They were compromised. Harmon's men knew who they were and, worse, that they were digging. The time for quiet investigation was over. This was about to become something else entirely. "Eleanor, can you make copies of everything?" Frank asked, his voice calm and level. "Digital copies, sent to a secure email address, something they can't find and delete." Eleanor nodded, her face set with determination. "I can do better. I can certify them as official county records. It'll take me a few hours, but once it's done, they're public. He can't make them disappear." "Good," Frank said. He turned to Sarah. "We need to move. Now." They left the evidence with Eleanor and walked out the front of the courthouse, trying to look casual, like any other citizens finishing their business. The man in the navigator watched them, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. But he didn't move. Frank led Sarah away from their truck, walking in the opposite direction, melting into the light foot traffic of the town's main street. He didn't look back. He knew the man in the SUV would be on the phone, reporting their position. They were being herded. He needed a secure line, a way to reach out to a world Harmon couldn't touch. There was a name he hadn't used in years, a number he knew by heart. A former teammate from ST3, Marcus Hex Thorne, who now did high-level security consulting. Frank found a payphone, a relic from another era, outside a closed-down gas station. He fed it a handful of quarters and dialed. Hex picked up on the second ring. "This number is no longer in service," he said, the standard-coded greeting. Frank replied with the countersign. "The tide at Coronado is high tonight." There was a pause, then Hex's voice, warm and familiar. "Frankie boy, I was wondering when you'd fall off the end of the earth and call. What's wrong?" Frank explained the situation in clipped, precise sentences. The eviction, the sealed room, the journal, Harmon, the evidence. He left nothing out. "They've got eyes on me, Hex. Local LE is compromised. I've got my daughter with me. I have the originals, but a county clerk is making certified copies." "Harmon," Hex said, a thoughtful tone in his voice. "I know that name. His company has some federal contracts. He's got friends in high places. This is bigger than some local land grab, Frank." He told Frank to sit tight, to stay off the grid. He would make a call to a contact at the Department of Justice, someone in the public integrity section. "But Frank, you need to stay alive for the next 24 hours. They're going to come for you, and they're going to come for that evidence, and they'll use your girl to get to you." The words sent a chill down Frank's spine. He hung up the phone, feeling the full weight of the danger he'd pulled Sarah into. They found a small, family-run diner on the edge of town. They took a booth in the back, away from the windows. While Sarah picked at a plate of fries, Frank watched the door, his body angled for a quick exit. An hour later, his phone, a cheap burner he'd bought that morning, buzzed. It was an encrypted message from Hex. "DOJ agent en route from Portland. ETA 18 hours. Name is Special Agent Kincaid. She will meet you at the Barlow Sheriff's Office. Do not trust local deputies." 18 hours. It felt like a lifetime. Just then, 2 county sheriff's deputies walked into the diner. They weren't there for coffee. Their eyes scanned the room, and they locked onto Frank. One of them, a big man with a florid face and Harmon's name practically stitched on his uniform, started walking toward their booth. Frank knew this was it. The friendly approach, then the cuffs, then a quiet trip to a ditch somewhere. He put a hand on Sarah's arm under the table. "When I move, you go out the kitchen door. Don't stop." The lead deputy stopped at their table, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. "Frank Cole?" he asked, his voice deceptively pleasant. "We'd like to ask you a few questions down at the station. A Mr. Harmon filed a complaint. Breaking and entering." Frank looked up at him, his face a mask of calm. "I'm just having lunch with my daughter, officer." "The lunch can wait," the deputy said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He gestured for Frank to stand up. Frank knew this was a critical moment. If he went with them, he and Sarah would disappear, and Arthur Vance's evidence would be buried forever. He had to refuse, but he couldn't escalate to violence here, not with civilians around. He was out of options. Just as he was about to stand, the diner's front door opened again. Eleanor Vance walked in. She strode directly to their booth, carrying a large manila envelope. She placed it on the table with a firm thud. "Here are your copies, Mr. Cole," she said in a loud, clear voice that carried through the quiet diner. "All certified and filed. Another complete set has been couriered to the State Attorney General's office. The receipt is right on top." The deputy's face went pale. He stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. The game had just changed, and he knew it. Taking Frank now wouldn't stop the evidence. It would just confirm its authenticity. He looked from Eleanor to Frank, his bluff called. He muttered something into his shoulder mic, then turned and walked out of the diner, his partner trailing behind him. They had bought themselves time. But Frank knew Harmon wouldn't give up. If he couldn't seize the evidence, he would destroy the source. He would destroy the house. He looked at Sarah. "We have to go back," he said. "He's going to try and demolish it tonight. Bury that room for good." The final confrontation wouldn't be in a courthouse or a police station. It would be on the patch of dirt where it all began, at a house that held the ghosts of the past and the key to their future. The stand would have to be made there. They left the diner through the kitchen, just as Frank had planned. The cook, a wiry man with a faded Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, gave Frank a sharp nod as they passed. He'd seen the deputies, and he understood. Out in the alley, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. Frank knew Harmon's next move as if he were planning it himself. The certified copies Eleanor had created were a problem, but the house itself was the primary crime scene. The sealed room, the tool marks, Arthur Vance's lingering presence. It was powerful, tangible proof. Harmon would want it gone before federal agents could get a warrant to search it. He would order the demolition moved up, or more likely, he would arrange for an accident. A fire. It was clean, destructive, and easily blamed on vagrants or faulty wiring. Frank drove them not to the house, but to a derelict auto body shop across the street from it. The windows were boarded up, but a side door hung open on rusted hinges. It provided a perfect, concealed observation post with a clear line of sight to the property. He parked the truck several blocks away, and they walked back, carrying a small bag with water, a first aid kit, and his phone. He found a spot on the second floor, by a grimy window he could peer through. He set his phone up on a stack of old tires, aimed it at the house, and hit record. "What are we waiting for?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper in the dusty dark. "We're waiting for them to show their hand," Frank said, "and we're going to be the ones to witness it." They waited. Hours passed. The streetlights came on, casting long shadows. Grit lay at Frank's feet, utterly still, his ears swiveling to catch every sound. Around 2 a.m., a large flatbed truck rumbled down the street, not with a bulldozer, but with a single excavator. It was followed by the same contractor's pickup Frank had seen the night before. The two men got out, the one with the limp and the tall, thin one. They weren't a demolition crew. They cut the lock on the gate and guided the excavator onto the lawn. But the machine stayed silent. Instead, the two men pulled two large red gas cans from the back of their truck. Arson, just as he'd predicted. They started splashing gasoline along the foundation of the house, the fumes sharp and acrid even from across the street. This was the moment. Frank was about to call 911 to report a fire in progress, knowing it would be a race between the fire department and Harmon's influence. But before he could dial, Grit moved. The dog had been a coiled spring of tension, and now he exploded into action. He sensed the immediate existential threat to the place that held the secret, the place that was part of his pack's story. With a savage bark that ripped through the night, he launched himself from the second-story window, landing with a heavy thud on the soft ground below. He was a blur of black fur and righteous fury, charging across the street directly at the two men. They were caught completely by surprise. The tall man dropped his gas can and stumbled backward. The man with the limp, however, reacted with brutal swiftness. As Grit leaped for him, he swung his heavy work boot in a vicious kick that caught the dog square in the ribs. Grit yelped, a sound of pure pain, and was thrown sideways, tumbling to the ground. Something inside Frank snapped. The cold, calculating operator was gone, replaced by a white-hot rage. He didn't think. He moved. He was out of the building and across the street in seconds. The tall man was fumbling for something in his jacket, a gun. Frank didn't give him the chance to draw it. He closed the distance and struck him once, a precise, devastating blow to the side of the neck. The man crumpled without a sound. The man with the limp turned, his eyes wide with shock, and swung the empty gas can at Frank's head. Frank ducked under it, stepped inside the man's guard, and used his own momentum against him, driving him hard into the side of the excavator. The man's head hit the steel tread with a sickening crack, and he slid to the ground, unconscious. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The street was silent again, save for the whimpering of the dog. Frank ran to Grit's side. The dog was trying to get up, his back legs trembling. Frank ran his hands gently along his ribs, feeling the unnatural give of broken bones. He scooped the 70-pound dog into his arms as if he weighed nothing. Sarah was there then, her face pale with shock and fear, her hands going to Grit's head, murmuring his name. Headlights flooded the street. A sheriff's car, tires squealing, slid to a stop, blocking the road. The deputy who had confronted them in the diner jumped out, his gun drawn. "On the ground, Cole, now!" he yelled. But behind him, two more sets of headlights appeared. Two dark sedans, sleek and official, boxed the deputy's car in. A woman in a crisp suit stepped out of the lead car, her badge clipped to her belt. "Special Agent Kincaid, FBI," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with absolute authority. "Drop your weapon, deputy. This is now a federal crime scene." Agent Kincaid took control with an efficiency Frank could appreciate. The two unconscious men were cuffed and loaded into an ambulance under federal guard. The local deputies were disarmed and told to stand down, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Kincaid walked over to Frank, who was still kneeling by Grit's side. Her eyes took in the scene. The gas cans, the unconscious men, the recording phone still propped in the window across the street, and the wounded dog. "Senior Chief Cole?" she asked. "Your friend Hex speaks very highly of you." Frank just nodded, his attention on Grit. "My dog needs a vet." Kincaid spoke into her radio, and within minutes, an animal control van, escorted by another federal agent, arrived. They gently loaded Grit onto a stretcher. As they carried him away, the old dog lifted his head and looked at Frank, a look of unwavering trust and loyalty. Frank promised he'd be right behind him. With Sarah safe in one of the federal cars, Frank walked Kincaid through everything. He gave her the bag with Arthur Vance's journal and the original evidence. He showed her the recording on his phone, which had captured the entire arson attempt. And then he led her to the house, to the living room wall, and the crude, cut piece of steel. Kincaid shone her flashlight into the dark, dusty room, at the empty desk and the open, plundered box. 30 years, she said, her voice a mix of awe and anger. He was buried in here for 30 years. The unraveling was swift and total. The evidence Arthur Vance had collected, now backed by the attempted arson and obstruction of justice, was more than enough. Alistair Harmon was arrested at his sprawling mansion before the sun came up. The story broke wide open, a local scandal that became a national headline. The systematic fraud, the theft of land and water rights from dozens of families, and the disappearance of an investigative journalist, it all came pouring out. Eleanor Vance became a quiet hero, her meticulous work in preserving and certifying the evidence forming the backbone of the case. Frank and Sarah spent the next 2 days at a veterinary hospital in Portland, where Grit underwent surgery for 2 broken ribs and a punctured lung. He was old, the vet said, but he was a fighter. He would recover. During that time, the full scope of Harmon's crimes became public. The remains of Arthur Vance were found in the crawl space beneath the house, just as his journal had suggested. He had managed to cut his way out of the sealed room, but had likely succumbed to dehydration or injury before he could get out of the house. He was given a proper burial, and Eleanor was finally able to mourn the cousin she had never given up on. A federal victims fund was established using Harmon's seized assets. A significant portion was awarded to Frank and Sarah, not just as a reward, but as restitution for the illegal eviction that had started it all. It was more money than Frank had ever seen in his life. He knew exactly what to do with it. He didn't rent again. He bought a small 10-acre plot of land deep in the Oregon woods, with a creek running through it, and enough space that they would never have to worry about a new developer or a sudden notice on the door. He built a small, solid house with his own hands. He also used a portion of the money to start a small foundation in Arthur Vance's name, a legal aid fund for people facing wrongful evictions and intimidation from powerful landlords and developers. It was a way to finish the work the journalist had started, to ensure his sacrifice meant something beyond putting one corrupt man in prison. One afternoon, a year later, Frank was sitting on his new porch, watching the sun filter through the tall pines. Grit, now fully healed though he walked with a slight limp, was asleep at his feet. A car pulled up the long gravel driveway. It was Sarah, home from her first year of pre-law at the University of Oregon. She came and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just watching the trees. "You know," she said finally, "it's funny. Getting thrown out of that house was the worst thing that ever happened to us." Frank looked out at the land, at the solid roof over their heads, at the loyal dog breathing easy by his side. He thought of the sealed room, of the dead man's words, of the fight he had been pulled into. He had gone to that little rental house in Barlow looking for a place to disappear, a quiet corner of the world to lick his wounds and fade away. But the house, and the dog who never stopped listening to its secrets, had refused to let him. It had dragged him back into the light. "Yeah," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "And it was the best thing, too."